I have nothing left to lose, so I'm going to tell you the truth even if it kills me." The words tore out of Rowan Voss before she could stop them. Her voice cracked in the humid August air, thick enough to taste, as she stood in her cramped apartment doorway staring at 20 men in black suits lined up in the hallway like an army of shadow and silence. Their shoulders nearly touched the walls. Their eyes never blinked. Each one of them was built like a monument to something dangerous, and they all stood absolutely still, waiting. Their leader stepped forward. Vincent Corsetti. 6'2". Broad shoulders wrapped in a charcoal suit that cost more than everything she owned combined. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of storm clouds about to break. A thin scar ran from the corner of his left eye to his jaw, a map of violence carved into his skin. He wore a gold watch on his left wrist, a Patek Philippe worth $40,000, but his hands hung at his sides like weapons at rest. This was the man she had found bleeding on the highway 1 week ago. Behind Rowan, her daughter Emma breathed in the stifling heat of the apartment. 7 years old. Thin as a pencil. Wearing a dress she had pulled from the donation bin at the shelter 3 months ago. The girl's small hand gripped the back of her mother's delivery uniform, the fabric stained with grease and the exhaustion of double shifts. Rowan's own uniform clung to her skin. Sweat pooled between her shoulder blades. Her blonde hair, pulled back in a tight bun, was falling loose around her face. She was 28 years old but looked 40. Her husband had died 4 years ago, buried under medical debt that had metastasized into foreclosure and eviction and finally into this crumbling building on the east side of New York where the plaster cracked like old skin and the radiator hissed like something dying. She had $200 in her pocket. That was everything. That was all that stood between her and the street. Vincent Corsetti's eyes moved from her face to Emma's, and something shifted in his expression. Just for a moment. Just barely visible. A lieutenant standing to his left, Marco, with iron-grey hair and a scar tissue thick across his neck, noticed the shift and exchanged a glance with Nino, the younger man beside him, both of their faces registering something between shock and concern. "Mrs. Voss," Vincent said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, the kind of voice that made things happen when it spoke. "We need to talk about what you've done." But what she did not know was that saving his life had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy 2 people who wanted her erased from existence. She did not know that somewhere in this city, Tyler Brennan was already planning how to use her as leverage. She did not know that Sophie Langford, draped in designer silk and dangerous charm, had already begun spreading lies through the wealthy circles of Manhattan, calculated poison meant to isolate her and make her disappear. All she knew right now was the heat. The silence. The sound of Emma's breathing. The terrible fact that a man like this did not show up at the doors of people like her without bringing consequences that could crush them both. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. These stories matter. Your support helps us keep creating them. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to 7 days earlier, when Rowan's ancient van broke down in a storm that would change everything. 7 days before the hallway full of men in black suits. 7 days before Vincent Corsetti's cold grey eyes found her in that doorway. The highway stretched out in both directions like a tongue of wet asphalt swallowing the world. August had turned the air into something solid, something that pressed down from above like the weight of 1,000 failures. Rain fell so thick you could not see more than 20 feet ahead. The sky was the color of a bruise. The wind made sounds like something breaking. Rowan's van, a 2003 Ford that had been held together with prayers and duct tape for the last 6 years, had finally given up. The engine had made a sound like something dying, a grinding metal shriek that made her grip the steering wheel so hard her hands went white, and then the vehicle simply stopped. Just ceased. Just died right there at mile marker 47, 4 miles from the nearest exit, during a storm so thick the air felt suffocating. She sat in the driver's seat with her hand still gripping the wheel. Rain hammered the windshield. The wipers had stopped working 2 months ago. She stared through the blur at the empty highway ahead, and for a moment, she did not move. She did not even breathe. This was not supposed to happen. She had $17 in her wallet. 17. She had a delivery shift that started at 11, a shift that paid $92, money she desperately needed because Emma's school had sent another notice saying the medical insurance would not cover her daughter's dental work and the girl's back molar had a cavity the size of a bullet hole and it was going to cost $800 to fix, and Rowan had $800 nowhere in her life. And now the van was dead. The van was dead and she was trapped on a highway in a storm and the rain sounded like 1,000 small fists pounding on the roof. A sound cut through the rain. Engines. Multiple engines. She looked in the mirror and saw them first as shadows, then as shapes, then as reality. Black SUVs. At least 4 of them, moving fast through the rain like dark fish cutting through water. They slowed as they approached her. Rowan felt her heart rate climb into her throat. Women alone on highways in storms who see convoys of black vehicles arriving at midnight do not survive the stories they tell. She knew this. Every woman knew this. It was written into the very fabric of being a woman and being alone. She reached for the door handle. The convoy stopped. The sound of doors opening. Footsteps on wet asphalt. Multiple figures moving toward the van through rain that fell like a curtain of glass. A knock on the window. Rowan's hand moved slowly to the window switch. She considered not opening it. She considered driving away, but the van was dead, utterly dead, and there was nowhere to drive. She considered screaming, but who would hear her out here? Who would come? She pressed the button. The window lowered with a grinding sound. The man who leaned down to look at her was tall and broad and soaking wet. His expensive suit clung to his body like it was painted on him. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent and currently fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was being catalogued, assessed, measured for worth. It took her a moment to register that he was bleeding. Blood ran from a wound on his left shoulder, dark and wet against the white fabric of his shirt. His breathing was controlled, measured, but his pallor was grey. The scar on his face, that thin line running from eye to jaw, seemed to stand out in relief against his skin, white as bone. "My vehicle," he said, his voice exactly as it would sound 5 years later in her apartment doorway, deep and solid and like something carved from stone. "I need you to tell me if you have a phone." Rowan stared at him. She saw the men behind him, 3 of them, all wearing suits, all radiating the kind of controlled violence that comes from professional training. She saw their hands. She saw the bulges beneath their jackets. She saw the way they were arranged in a protective semicircle around this man, this wounded man, who seemed to be the thing they were protecting and the threat they were protecting against simultaneously. "Phone," she whispered. "Yes." She reached for her purse without taking her eyes off him. Her hands found her phone, a 5-year-old Android with a cracked screen. She held it up. The man did something then that would haunt her for the next 7 days. He smiled. Just slightly. Just barely. Just enough to show that beneath the violence and the blood and the terrible competence, there was something almost human still alive in him. "Thank you," he said. He took the phone. His fingers, when they touched hers, were ice-cold despite the heat of the August night. That small contact would reverberate through everything that came next. 7 days before the men in black showed up at her door, Rowan Voss sat in a delivery van that was slowly dying beneath her hands, and the August rain fell like the sky itself was weeping. The storm had rolled in around 9 o'clock that evening, turning the highway outside New York into something that barely resembled a road anymore. Rain hammered against the windshield in sheets so thick that even at full speed her wipers couldn't keep up. The asphalt ahead dissolved into a grey blur. Rowan gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles white, her shoulders tensed against the shaking of the vehicle as it pushed through standing water. The van was 23 years old. She had bought it for $2,000 from a man named Gerald who sold used vehicles out of a lot near the airport, and it had been dying ever since. The engine coughed. That sound, that wet, strangled cough, repeated 3 times, and then something seized deep in the machinery beneath the hood. The van coasted to a stop at 11:44 p.m. on a stretch of highway where the nearest exit was 4 miles back. Rowan sat very still. She did not move. She did not cry. She just sat there with her hand still gripping the wheel while the engine ticked and cooled around her. Behind her, in the cargo area, sat 17 dinner orders for a restaurant in Manhattan. Fish. Pasta. Covered plates that were rapidly losing their heat. The restaurant would charge her if she did not deliver them. The restaurant would keep her delivery fee if she arrived late. The restaurant would fire her if she abandoned the food. She had been driving for 14 hours. This was her second shift of the day. The first had ended at 6 o'clock, and she had been given $7 in tips by 5 different customers, which meant the 6th customer had paid her nothing at all. Rowan reached for her phone. The screen showed 17 missed calls. 17. They were all from creditors, from the bank, from lawyers representing creditors. The most recent message, timestamped at 11:34 p.m., was from a collection agency. Ms. Voss, you have 5 business days to settle your outstanding balance of $200,000 or foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately. She looked at her wallet. It sat on the passenger seat, leather cracked and faded. Inside it, she counted out the bills with trembling fingers. $200. That was all. $200 to last until her next paycheck on the 15th. $200 that would not cover the car payment, the insurance, the electric bill, or the deposit that was due for Emma's school uniforms. The rain continued to fall. It sounded like fists pounding on the roof of the van, like the sky was angry at her specifically, like the universe had decided that tonight was the night to demonstrate conclusively that she had lost control of everything. Her husband had been dead for 6 months. He had been a carpenter. He had been good at it, but not good enough, and his medical bills had eaten through their savings. Then the funeral had eaten through the rest. And then the grief had eaten through her ability to work efficiently, which meant she had taken the delivery job, which paid almost nothing, which meant she had defaulted on the second mortgage he had taken out without telling her, and now the bank owned her home and the bank owned her future and the bank owned the van, technically, because she was 17 payments behind. The headlights appeared first. Rowan saw them in her side mirror, 2 bright points of light approaching through the rain at high speed. Then another set of headlights. Then another. Black vehicles, long and expensive-looking, moving in formation like a parade of predators. They slowed as they approached her broken van. The convoy pulled in behind her, creating a corridor of automotive steel and glass. The vehicles did not stop immediately. They circled slowly, like sharks measuring an unfamiliar shape in the water. Then the lead SUV pulled around to her driver's side window and stopped parallel to her van. The window rolled down. A man's voice, calm and measured, spoke through the rain, "Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands visible." Rowan's breath came in shallow gasps. Her mind catalogued the things she knew. These were bad men. Everything about their formation, their precision, their complete lack of hesitation told her these were men who did violence the way other people did mathematics, with practiced ease and no emotional attachment. The logical response was to be afraid. The logical response was to comply and hope and pray that she was not about to die on a dark stretch of highway in the rain. But she had been afraid for 6 months. She had been afraid since the hospital called and told her that her husband had been electrocuted at a job site. She had been afraid through the funeral. She had been afraid at every eviction notice, every missed payment, every call from a creditor whose name she did not recognize. Fear had become as familiar as her own skin, and it had not saved her yet, so she was done with fear. Instead, Rowan turned off her engine, pushed open her door, and stepped into the rain. The storm immediately soaked through her delivery uniform, a blue polo shirt with the restaurant's logo and a pair of black polyester pants that clung to her legs. Water poured down her face. She stood beside her van with her hands at her sides, palms open, and waited. The back door of the lead SUV opened. The man who emerged was tall, easily 6'2" or 3", with the kind of shoulders that came from either genetics or violence or both. His suit was tailored, charcoal gray, and it was being rapidly destroyed by the rain. His dark hair, slicked back from his forehead, gleamed in the headlights. His face was angular, all sharp lines and sharper angles, and there was a scar running from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, thin and precise as though it had been drawn by a surgeon. But what stopped her breath was the fact that he was bleeding. Blood ran from a wound on his left side, dark and wet against the white fabric of his shirt. His hand pressed against the wound, and his fingers were stained crimson. His breathing was controlled, measured, but his face had taken on a pallor that belonged in a hospital, not standing in a rainstorm on the shoulder of a highway. 2 more men emerged from the vehicles behind him, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had trained together for years. Their names were Marco and Nino, though Rowan did not yet know this. What she knew was that they wore identical dark suits and they kept their hands free and visible, and they arranged themselves in a protective semicircle around the bleeding man, and they were scanning the darkness and the rain with the focused attention of predators who had just scented danger. The bleeding man looked at Rowan. His eyes were grey, not pale grey or sad grey, but the grey of storm clouds, the grey of winter metal, the grey of something that could cut. He assessed her the way a jeweler might assess a diamond, cataloguing every detail, every flaw, every possibility. His gaze moved across her wet uniform, her thin shoes soaked through, her calloused hands, her face streaked with rain. "My vehicle," he said, and his voice was exactly what a voice like that should be, deep and solid like an oath, like something that could not be broken, like something carved from stone. "I need you to tell me if you have a phone." Rowan's mouth was dry despite the rain. She stared at him. At the blood. At the men beside him. At the convoy of black vehicles arranged around them like a fortress made of steel and gasoline. At the carefully neutral expression on the bleeding man's face that suggested he was accustomed to other people's fear and had learned to accept it the way the ocean accepts rain. "Phone," she whispered. "Yes." She reached for her purse without looking away from him. Her hands found the pocket where she kept her phone, a 5-year-old Android with a cracked screen, the camera permanently smudged, the battery lasting only if she kept the brightness at minimum. She held it up. The bleeding man did something then that would echo through everything that came next. He smiled. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Just enough to show that beneath the violence, beneath the blood, beneath the terrible competence and the grey eyes and the scar, there was something almost human still alive in him. "Thank you," he said. He took the phone. When his fingers brushed against hers, they were ice-cold despite the heat of the August night and the fever that was clearly building in his body. That small contact, skin against skin for less than a second, would change everything that followed. "What's your name?" His voice was softer now. "Rowan," she said. "Rowan Voss." "Vincent Corsetti," he said. Not an introduction. A gift. A test. A promise or a threat, she could not yet tell which. "Rowan Voss, I need you to drive me somewhere. Can you do that?" She should have said no. She should have been afraid. She should have called the police from that very moment, or run into the rain, or done anything other than nod her head yes. But he was bleeding, and she was a woman who had spent her entire life picking up the pieces of broken things, and somewhere in the 6 months since her husband died, she had lost the ability to refuse anyone who needed help. "Yes," she said. "Get in my van." Marco moved forward, his hand already in his jacket, but Vincent raised his other hand, the hand not pressed against his wound, and Marco stopped. Vincent climbed into the passenger seat of the delivery van, leaving a trail of blood droplets on the fabric of her seat. Marco took the driver's seat of the lead SUV, and Nino positioned himself in one of the vehicles behind them. Rowan walked around to the driver's side. The rain pounded down. Thunder echoed across the empty highway. She got in, closed the door, and started the engine. It coughed, caught, held. "There's a gas station 3 miles north," Marco said over her phone, which Vincent held. "You'll turn east at the exit. After that, I'll direct you." Rowan pulled back onto the highway. In her mirror, the convoy of black SUVs followed at a precise distance. Vincent sat beside her, his hand still pressed against his wound, his grey eyes fixed on something in the distance that she could not see. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not a question. Rowan thought of her husband in a hospital bed. She thought of the creditors calling. She thought of Emma's borrowed school uniforms. She thought of the past 6 months, of falling and falling and falling with nothing to catch her. "I lost my husband," she said quietly. "Fear doesn't scare me anymore." In the passenger seat, Vincent Corsetti, who had built an empire through violence and loss, who had killed men with his bare hands, who had sworn 15 years ago that he would never feel anything ever again, felt something shift in his chest that he had thought was dead. The apartment was already burning when Rowan woke. Not the slow creep of smoke under the door. Not the distant smell of something electrical gone wrong. The flames had already eaten through the wall of the bedroom next to theirs, and the heat woke her the way a slap wakes you, sudden, impossible to ignore, leaving no room for grogginess or disbelief. She smelled it first. Burning plastic. Burning wood. Burning everything they owned. The smoke hung thick in the darkness like a living thing, and when she sat up, it clawed at her throat. 2 in the morning. The clock on the nightstand glowed red in the darkness before the heat made it flicker and die. Emma. Her daughter's name was already leaving her mouth before her feet touched the floor. "Emma, wake up. We have to go. Now." Emma was 6 years old. She slept in borrowed pajamas from the shelter donation center, her small body curled under a blanket that smelled like someone else's detergent, someone else's life. When Rowan lifted her, Emma didn't wake, just made that soft, confused sound children make when they're pulled from sleep into something their minds can't quite process as real. The hallway was already thick with it. The smoke didn't rise gently like in movies. It fell and clung and filled the space like water. Rowan kept Emma's face pressed against her shoulder, kept her own eyes half shut, trying to remember where the stairs were, trying to remember if she'd locked the door to their apartment or if that even mattered anymore because the whole building was burning. The heat pushed against her skin like something with weight and intention. Her nightgown caught the temperature and held it against her body. She could feel the fire now, not seeing it, not yet, but feeling its presence like a hand on her back, pushing her forward, faster, burning. Down the stairs. 1 flight. 2. Each step down was a step closer to air that didn't taste like ash. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the fire finding new things to consume. Wood cracking. Glass exploding in the pressure of heat expanding against cold. The fire had a sound like breathing, like something alive and hungry. The ground floor. The front door. When she pushed it open, the night air hit her like a shock, cold and real, and oxygen, so much oxygen her lungs gasped for it. She ran barefoot into the street in her nightgown, Emma still asleep against her chest, and she didn't stop running until she was half a block away and the building was fully visible behind her, its windows glowing orange, flames visible now through the glass like demons pressed against the panes trying to get out. She stood there in the middle of the street at 2 in the morning, soaked in sweat and smoke, holding her daughter, and she watched the fire department arrive. Red lights painting everything the color of blood. Firefighters running with equipment that looked too small to fight something that big, that angry, that alive. Electrical fire, a man in a chief's uniform told her, his voice steady in the way of people who have seen this exact tragedy 100 times before. Old building. These things happen. You're lucky you got out when you did. Lucky. The word didn't mean anything anymore. What it meant was that she had saved Emma. What it meant was that everything else was burning. The clothes she'd owned. The 3 photographs of her husband. The wedding ring she'd pawned 6 months ago and then somehow taken back from the pawn shop with money she didn't have, wearing it again on a chain around her neck for reasons she couldn't explain to anyone, not even herself. What it meant was that Emma still had nothing. The sun came up over a city that didn't care. It rose the way it always did, indifferent to fire and loss, casting light on the blackened shell of the building where Rowan had lived for 8 months with her daughter. The ash was still warm when she stood in what used to be the ground floor hallway, a firefighter on either side of her, walking her through to retrieve what could be retrieved. Nothing could be retrieved. The hallway was a graveyard of charred furniture and destroyed dreams. The apartment was gone completely, a cavity of black and nothing, open to the sky where the upper floors had collapsed. Emma stood beside her in a borrowed dress from the shelter. Rowan didn't know what she'd been wearing when they grabbed her from sleep, but someone had found clothes and brought them. Everything was borrowed now. Everything would always be borrowed. Mommy. Emma's voice was small. Where do we live now? Rowan opened her mouth. Closed it. The question had no answer that wouldn't terrify a 6-year-old girl who had already been terrified enough in her short life. That was when the black car pulled up. It moved slowly through the destroyed street like a shark through water, pristine and perfect, completely out of place in a neighborhood of ash and soot and people who owned nothing. The car was black. The windows were tinted. The engine was so quiet you could barely hear it. Marco stepped out. He wore a suit that probably cost more than the building that had just burned. His dark eyes found Rowan in the crowd, and he moved toward her with the kind of certainty that made other people get out of his way. Mrs. Voss. He held out an envelope. His voice was the color of steel. Mr. Corsetti heard about the fire. He wants to help. Rowan looked at the envelope. She looked at Marco. She thought about the man bleeding in the passenger seat of her van, his hand pressed against a wound that should have killed him, his grey eyes watching her like she was the only thing tethering him to the world. I don't take charity, she said. Marco's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle loosening, like he'd been braced for exactly this response. It's not charity, he said quietly. You saved his life. He's returning the favor. He placed the envelope in her hand. His grip was warm. His fingers were scarred in the way that suggests a lifetime of violence, and yet his touch was gentle, almost apologetic, like he was sorry for what those scars meant and what they might represent to someone as fragile as her. He got back in the car. The car drove away. Rowan opened the envelope. Inside was a key. And a note, written in handwriting that was surprisingly elegant for hands that had probably killed people. The handwriting of a man who'd been educated once, before vengeance became his curriculum. That evening, Marco drove her and Emma to an apartment in a building that made her throat close. The lobby had marble floors. There was a doorman. The air smelled like money, like flowers and leather and the kind of climate control that costs more per month than she used to make in a week. Apartment 3408. The key opened a door to a space that couldn't be real. High ceilings. Windows overlooking Manhattan. A kitchen she'd never learned how to use because she'd never had anything fancier than a hot plate. 2 bedrooms. 2 full bathrooms. A living room that smelled like fresh paint and new possibility. Emma walked to the window and pressed her small face against the glass. Mommy, look. You can see so far. Rowan stood in the doorway holding a plastic bag with their entire possessions. 1 change of clothes. Emma's borrowed shoes from the shelter, the only item that mattered, worn soft from use, holding the shape of a child learning to walk. Her husband's wedding ring, still on the chain around her neck. A photo of him, warped by water from the fire truck. Marco and Nino waited by the door, hands clasped in front of them like undertakers at a funeral. Like they understood they were witnessing something they shouldn't see, a woman stepping across a threshold into a life that wasn't hers, into debt that could never be repaid, into obligation that would follow her like a shadow. There's an account set up for you, Marco said. For groceries. For Emma's school. For whatever you need. Rowan didn't ask how much was in the account. She was terrified of the answer. That night, after Emma was asleep in a bed that had never belonged to anyone else before, Rowan sat on the edge of the mattress and held the small shoes in her hands. They were disintegrating. The leather was falling apart. The laces had been replaced 3 times by volunteer workers at the shelter who understood that these shoes meant something. When Emma was born, the shelter had given her these shoes. Size 1. Pink with tiny flowers embroidered on the toes. Emma had worn them for exactly 2 months before her feet grew. Rowan had kept them anyway, wrapped in plastic, waiting for a child who might need them more than her own daughter did. But there was no child more in need than her own daughter. So she'd kept them for memory instead. For proof that even in the worst circumstances, even when you're living in a place that used to be a storage closet, even when you can't afford to eat most days, your child can still wear shoes with flowers on them and be loved. She held them against her chest and she didn't cry, because she'd stopped crying somewhere around month 4 of her husband's medical bills. But she felt the weight of what was happening. She felt it like a stone in her chest, pressing down, settling in. She owed Vincent Corsetti her life now. More than that, she owed him her daughter's life. And she didn't yet understand that debt was a thing that could never be measured, never be equal, never be repaid. 3 days after the fire, Vincent came to the apartment. He knocked. That was the first shock, that he knocked, waiting for permission to enter his own property, this space that he'd paid for with money that probably came from things Rowan didn't want to know about. She opened the door and found him standing in the hallway with Marco and Nino behind him like bookends. He wore an open collared shirt despite the heat, and the scar that ran from his right eye to his jaw was fully visible, a thin silver line that told a story of violence survived. "May I come in?" His voice was exactly as she remembered. Deep. Controlled. Like thunder that had learned to speak. She stepped back. He entered the apartment like a man entering a museum, careful, aware of his own size and power in the space, trying to make himself smaller for the sake of someone fragile. Emma was on the couch. She looked up from the coloring book a neighbor had given her, and when she saw Vincent, she went very still. Children understand danger without being taught. They sense it the way animals sense storms. But Vincent knelt down. Not sat down. Actually lowered himself to one knee so that his face was level with Emma's. And when he spoke, his voice changed. It became softer. It became the kind of gentle that should not have been possible from a man built on violence. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Emma held up the paper. Stick figures. A yellow sun. A house that didn't look like any house architecture could produce. "That's me and Mommy and a house we're going to have someday." Vincent studied it like it was the most important thing anyone had ever shown him. "This house," he said, "looks like a place where people are safe." "I like that." Marco and Nino exchanged a look. The kind of look that said they had never, in however many years they'd served this man, seen him speak to anyone like that. Like they were witnessing something unprecedented. Like the ground beneath them had shifted slightly and they weren't sure if it would hold. Vincent stood up and turned to Rowan. "Tell me about the debts." She told him. It came out like she'd been holding it in and the pressure finally broke the seal. Her husband dying. The medical bills. The hidden gambling debt she didn't know he had until the creditors called. $200,000. 200,000. She said the number 4 times and it still didn't sound real. "They gave me 5 days, she said. That was 8 months ago. Now they're saying if I don't pay the full amount in 3 days, they take Emma into state custody. They said it like it's a favor. Like they're giving me a chance." Vincent listened. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there and let her speak, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You asked me something in your van that night," he said. "Do you remember what you asked me?" She had asked him who he was. Not because she cared, but because everyone had been dressed in black and professional and terrifying, and she'd needed to know if he was the kind of man who would hurt her. "You didn't ask," he said. "But if you had, I would have told you that I am the kind of man people owe favors to. I am the kind of man who collects debts. But I am also the kind of man who remembers when someone chooses to help me instead of running away." He took a step closer. Not threatening. Just present. $200,000, he said, is a problem I can solve before lunch. Rowan felt something crack open in her chest. Relief and terror and gratitude and the dawning understanding that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. "Why would you help me?" she whispered. "I am nobody." Vincent's grey eyes locked onto hers. You didn't ask who I was before you stopped the bleeding. You didn't care if I could help you. You just helped. That makes you not nobody. That makes you the only somebody who has ever mattered to me. There was a knock at the door. Marco answered it before Rowan could move. Tyler Brennan stood in the hallway, and his presence filled the apartment like smoke, thick and choking and wrong. He was in his mid-30s. His suit was worth more than anything Rowan would ever own. His cologne arrived before he did, announcing him like a threat made fragrant. And his smile was the smile of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "Uncle Vincent," he said, stepping inside without being invited. "I heard you were playing hero. Charity for the help. How very philanthropic." Vincent didn't move. Didn't acknowledge him. Just stood there watching as Tyler looked around the apartment like he was appraising a property, like he was cataloguing everything and already deciding what was valuable and what could be discarded. "So you're the widow," Tyler said to Rowan, and his eyes moved across her body like fingers, like he was trying to touch her without permission. "The charity case. The one my uncle is throwing money at like it grows on trees." "Get out of my home," Rowan said. The words came out steady. She didn't know where they came from. But they came. Tyler laughed. Actually laughed, like she'd said something adorable and stupid. "Your home." He gestured around the apartment. "This isn't your home, sweetheart. This is my uncle's property. You're just living in it because he feels sorry for you. And you want to know something funny? I'm going to make him stop feeling sorry for you very soon." He circled her. Slowly. Like a predator sizing up prey. "You see, my uncle and I have a disagreement about how this family should be run. He thinks he's in charge. I think I should be. And you're going to help me settle it." He stopped in front of her. Close enough that she could smell the cologne and something else underneath it, something that smelled like rotting fruit and desperation. "Accidents happen to people who get in the way of what I want," he said softly. "Accidents happen to their children too." The threat hung in the air like a physical thing. Emma made a small sound from the couch, a whimper, a child's understanding that something dangerous had just entered the room. Vincent moved. It was the only word for it. One moment he was standing still. The next moment he had Tyler by the throat, had lifted him off the ground, had his back against the wall with enough force that the wall itself seemed to protest. "Never," Vincent said, and his voice had become something else entirely. Something that had no mercy in it, no gentleness, no space for humanity. "Never again will you speak about this woman or her child. Never again will you enter any space where she is. Never again will you draw a breath in her presence. Do you understand me?" Tyler was turning purple. His hands clawed at Vincent's wrist, and Vincent didn't even acknowledge the nails breaking skin, drawing blood, the physical desperation of a man being suffocated. "Do you understand me?" Vincent said again. Tyler nodded, a jerking movement. Vincent released him, and Tyler collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, gasping, retching, understanding finally that he had just learned something about his uncle that he should have understood years ago. Marco and Nino moved in. They didn't throw Tyler out so much as escort him, their grip on his arms final and absolute. The kind of escort that meant he would be lucky if he ever saw this building again, much less ever entered it. The door closed. Rowan was shaking. Emma was crying. Vincent stood in the middle of the apartment with blood running down his wrist from where Tyler's nails had gouged him, and he looked at Rowan and something in his expression shifted back to gentleness. "I'm sorry you saw that," he said. But he wasn't sorry. They both knew he wasn't sorry. He was just sorry that she had to witness what he was capable of, that she had to understand the full weight of what it meant that she had attached herself to him. The next morning, Rowan took Emma to the free clinic for her 6-month checkup. The waiting room was crowded with people like them, people who couldn't afford better, who sat in plastic chairs and filled out forms with shaking hands and tried not to breathe too hard so they wouldn't take up too much space in the world. That was when Sophie Langford sat down beside her. Sophie was exactly the opposite of Rowan in every measurable way. Her clothes were designer. Her nails were manicured. Her skin glowed with the kind of expensive skincare that costs more than Rowan's monthly grocery allowance. She smelled like perfume that probably had a name and a waiting list. She sat down and crossed her legs and looked at Rowan with the kind of smile that made your teeth hurt. "You must be the woman everyone's talking about," Sophie said, and her voice was honey made of poison. "Vincent Corsetti's little project." Rowan didn't respond. She'd learned that sometimes silence was safer than words. "I'm Sophie Langford," Sophie continued, undeterred. "I have some connections in this city. Some very influential connections. And I wanted to warn you about something, woman to woman. As a favor, really." "I don't need your favors," Rowan said. "Of course you don't." Sophie laughed. It was a beautiful laugh. It was also the most terrifying sound Rowan had ever heard. "But you should know how things work in New York society. Reputations are delicate things. One whisper from the right person in the right ear, and a reputation can crumble like ash." She leaned closer. The perfume was choking. A widow. A child. Living in an apartment owned by a dangerous man. People will say terrible things about you. They'll say you're a gold digger. They'll say you're sleeping your way into his life. They'll say your daughter isn't safe with you. And once people start saying those things, it becomes true, whether it was true to begin with or not. Rowan felt her hands clenching into fists. "Let them talk," she said. Sophie's smile widened. "Oh, they will. And when they're done talking, no shelter will take you. No employer will hire you. No one will believe a word you say. You and your daughter will be completely alone." She stood up. She left a business card on the chair. "When you're ready to leave quietly, call me. I'll make sure you and your daughter are taken care of. I'm very good at taking care of problems." She walked away, and Rowan understood with sudden, chilling clarity that Sophie wasn't threatening her out of malice. She was doing it with the same kind of gentle inevitability that a shark uses when it smells blood in the water. That evening, Vincent sent a car for her. The restaurant was called Dante's, and it was the kind of place where you didn't see a menu until you'd already been seated and someone had explained the evening's preparations to you in Italian. The lighting was low. The tables were spaced far apart. Every other patron seemed to be someone important, someone dangerous, someone who had done things that had permanent consequences. They were led to a private booth in the back. Vincent's regular table, Marco told her as they walked. The booth where he conducted business. The booth where he'd eaten hundreds of meals alone, thinking about death and revenge and empire. Tonight he waited for her there, and when she slid into the seat across from him, he didn't eat. He just watched her while the waiters brought courses she didn't order, pasta that melted on her tongue, fish that tasted like the ocean, wine that tasted like velvet and danger. "My father was murdered when I was 17, Vincent said, and his voice was the sound of old wounds being opened. I watched it happen. I was hiding in a storage closet, my father's choice, not cowardice. He told me to hide and I did, and I heard 3 gunshots and I heard him fall, and I stayed in that closet for 3 hours after because I was too afraid to come out." Rowan didn't move. She barely breathed. This was a confession. This was a man taking off his armor and showing her the wound underneath. "When I came out," he continued, "I was different. The boy who'd been hiding was gone, and something else came out instead. Something built on vengeance. I spent 15 years building an empire on his blood, and I spent 15 years telling myself that I would never feel anything ever again. That feeling was weakness. That love was a liability. That the only thing that mattered was power and control." He took a sip of wine. "Then I bled out on a rainy highway and a widow in a delivery van chose to help me. And everything I've spent 15 years believing turned out to be a lie." He reached across the table. Not to touch her. Just to make his point. "You changed everything. Rowan felt the weight of his words like a physical thing. She felt them settling into her chest, into her bones, into the deepest part of her where hope and terror lived in the same space. "I'm not part of your world," she said quietly. "You became part of it the moment you didn't drive away," he replied. And in that moment, Rowan understood the impossible position she was in. To love this man, because she did, God help her, she already did, was to make herself a target. It was to paint a bullseye on herself and Emma and everyone who mattered to her. It was to choose danger and darkness and the very real possibility that one day someone would make her pay for the crime of caring about a mafia boss. She set down her wine glass with hands that trembled. "I have to use the restroom," she said, and she stood up before he could see her face crumble, before he could witness the moment when she made the decision that would change everything. She walked to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. And she understood with terrible clarity what she had to do. She had to leave. She had to disappear. She had to take Emma and vanish in the middle of the night, the same way she'd saved her daughter from the fire. The same way she'd learned to survive every terrible thing that life had thrown at her. The only way to protect Emma was to protect Vincent from herself. The kitchen was suffocating. Humid August air pressed against the windows of Rowan's apartment like something alive, something waiting. She sat at the small table where she and Emma ate their rationed meals, and in front of her lay a piece of notebook paper that represented the only honest thing she had left to give. The pen trembled in her hand. 4:30 in the morning. The city outside was still asleep, and Emma lay in the next room, small and breathing softly under a blanket that had cost $3 at a yard sale. Rowan could hear her daughter's breathing through the thin walls. Every inhale was a reminder of what she stood to lose. She pressed the pen to the paper and began to write. "Vincent, by the time you read this, I will be gone." The words came in fractured pieces, each sentence a small death. The fan in the corner rattled with a sound like distant gunfire, the only noise in the apartment besides the scratch of the pen and her own ragged breathing. She could taste the salt of tears before they even fell. How did you explain to someone that loving them was a death sentence? How did you tell a man built from power and vengeance that your presence in his life was poison? She thought of his hand across the restaurant table the night before, not quite touching hers but close enough that she felt the heat radiating from his skin. She thought of the way his voice had cracked when he spoke about his father, how for just a moment the mafia boss had disappeared and what remained was only a boy who had watched someone he loved get destroyed. She wrote, "I am not strong enough for your world. Emma is not safe near me. The people you have made enemies of would use her against you, would use her to break you, and I cannot live with that knowledge. I cannot be the reason your empire falls or the reason your child, because I know you are thinking of her as yours too, becomes a target. Some acts of love require disappearing. This is mine." Her handwriting was a mess. Shaking. The letters slid across the page like they were being written by someone drowning. The humid air made the paper curl slightly at the edges. She set down the pen and pressed her palm against her forehead, trying to stop the spinning in her head. On the windowsill behind her sat Emma's first pair of shoes. They were tiny, impossibly tiny, white leather with a single buckle, size 4.5. Rowan had saved them when Emma outgrew them at 3 years old, and she had carried them through every eviction, every setback, every moment when she considered giving up. Those shoes represented the first time someone had given her something freely. A woman at the shelter had bought them, no strings attached, no debt incurred. Just kindness. Just the radical act of believing that a child deserved something beautiful. Rowan's eyes landed on those shoes and her hand stopped moving. She picked up the pen again. "But I cannot leave without you knowing that what you did for us, what you continue to do, has changed something fundamental in me. You looked at my daughter and saw a person worthy of protection. You held her hand like she mattered. You do not know this, but last week when you were reading her that book about the princess, she told me, he listens like mommy does. That is everything. That is the entire world." The pen hovered over the paper. "I love you. God help me, I do. But love sometimes means stepping out of someone's life so they can actually live in it. I am stepping out. Please do not look for me. She signed her name. Rowan Voss. Just the name, nothing more. Nothing else fit. The letter sat on the table in front of her for 30 seconds while her body made its final argument against this decision. Her hand shook as she folded the paper in thirds. She was about to set it on the kitchen counter where he would find it, next to the note for Emma's school explaining that they were moving, that there would be no forwarding address. That was when the knocking came. Not a knock. A series of them. Deliberate. Measured. Early morning knocking that meant police or danger or news that destroyed your life before breakfast. Rowan's heart stopped in her chest like a small animal struck by a car. She looked at the clock, for 27 in the morning, and then at Emma's closed bedroom door. She opened the apartment door to find Vincent Corsetti standing in the hallway with Marco and Nino flanking him like shadows. Vincent was still in his suit from the previous night, but now it was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his dark eyes burning with something between fury and devastation. In his hand, he held the goodbye letter. How? Rowan whispered. Marco checked on you at first light, Vincent said, his voice like gravel. He saw this through the window. Vincent held up the folded paper. Not crumpled. Not torn. But held like it was something sacred and terrible all at once. His men stepped backward, giving them space, disappearing into the hallway's shadows the way trained soldiers do when their boss needs privacy for something personal. You were going to take my daughter and disappear into the night, Vincent said. It was not a question. Your daughter? Rowan's voice broke. She is not your daughter, Vincent. She is my daughter, and I am trying to save her life. By tearing hers apart. He stepped inside the apartment without waiting for permission, and Marco closed the door softly behind them. The space suddenly felt too small. The humidity felt suffocating. You think leaving protects me? You think I built this empire by letting people I care about walk into danger alone? I am not part of your world. I am a liability. I am a weakness they will exploit. Vincent moved toward her and for a moment she flinched, but he stopped. He simply stood there, the goodbye letter crushed in his fist, and when he spoke his voice had changed into something raw. You stopped on a highway in a storm to save a stranger bleeding to death. A stranger you had never met. You did not know I was Mafia. You did not know what I was capable of. You just stopped. You risked everything for someone who mattered to you in that moment, and that is the definition of strength. That is the only definition that matters. He uncrumpled the letter. Smoothed it against his leg. You wrote that you love me. Vincent. You wrote it. I am holding the proof. Before Rowan could respond, before she could find words for the impossible thing happening in her kitchen, the apartment door exploded inward. Not opened. Exploded. Tyler Brennan stood in the doorframe with 3 men behind him, all of them armed, all of them wearing the expression of people who believed themselves invincible. Tyler was 26 years old, with his uncle's dark hair but none of his intelligence, dressed in a suit that cost more than Rowan's rent but worn like he was playing dress-up in his father's closet. His gun was raised, pointed directly at Vincent's chest. Uncle Vincent, Tyler said, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had never experienced real consequences. Always the sentimental fool. Step away from the woman and maybe I'll let you live. Vincent did not move. I have been planning this for 2 years, Tyler continued, moving fully into the apartment. Building my own connections. Working with people from the families you destroyed. You are old, uncle. Soft. You care about things. Loyalty. Honor. Love. Weakness. I am going to show them all how power actually works. Where is Emma? Vincent asked quietly. Still sleeping, I assume, Tyler said. We came for you first. For her. For leverage. The word leverage hung in the air like poison gas. That was when the windows exploded inward. Not shattered. Exploded. 12 men in tactical gear moved like ghosts through every entrance simultaneously: windows, back door, bedroom, living room. They moved with the precision of people who had trained for this exact scenario, and Tyler's 3 men had exactly enough time to realize their mistake before Marco disarmed them with an efficiency that spoke of decades of practice. The guns clattered to the floor like useless metal. Tyler tried to run. He made it 2 steps before Nino caught him by the collar and threw him against the wall with enough force to crack plaster. The sound was like a gunshot in the humid air. Tyler's arms went up instinctively to protect his face, but what happened next was worse than pain. What happened was understanding. He understood that he had lost. Tyler slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his entitled smirk melting into something unrecognizable. His hands were shaking. His breath came in gasps. He was crying before he could stop himself, tears running down his face like a child who had just realized that the world did not work the way he thought it did. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I am family." Vincent walked past him without looking down. He went directly to Emma's bedroom door and opened it slowly, carefully, checking that his niece was still asleep, still safe. Then he returned to the living room and nodded once to Marco. Federal agents emerged from the hallway. 6 of them, wearing jackets that said FBI in white letters. They had been waiting in the stairwell, had been watching the building for weeks, had been gathering evidence. Tyler's face went completely white. "Tyler Brennan," the lead agent said, pulling out handcuffs. "You are under arrest for RICO violations, embezzlement, conspiracy with organized crime, and attempted kidnapping." Tyler screamed about family loyalty as they dragged him out. His own men would not even look at him. One of them, a lieutenant named Danny, actually turned away as they passed, a gesture of such complete rejection that it meant more than any words could. In the Mafia, betrayal was death. In the Mafia, family was law. And Tyler had violated both. But Sophie Langford's destruction came later that evening. By the time the news broke, Rowan had showered the fear off her skin and changed into clothes that did not smell like sweat and desperation. Emma was awake and being kept occupied by one of Vincent's men teaching her how to make pasta, a scene so absurdly domestic that Rowan almost forgot about the horror that had happened at dawn. The television flickered to life at exactly 6 o'clock. Every news channel carried the same story. Recordings. Videos. Financial documents. Photographs of Sophie Langford meeting with Tyler, coordinating campaigns of social destruction against dozens of women over the years. Rowan had gathered the evidence, photographs from the restaurant, recordings of conversations she had overheard, financial records that Tyler had carelessly left in the bathroom the night before the arrest. And Vincent had moved faster than anyone could have predicted. Sophie was at a charity gala when the first news alert dropped. Rowan could imagine it perfectly. The moment when every phone in the room lit up simultaneously. The whispers that turned to shouts. The society matrons that Sophie considered friends simply walking away, their backs turning like doors closing on her entire world. By midnight, her husband had filed for divorce. By the next morning, federal agents were at her door with warrants and handcuffs. The photograph on the evening news showed Sophie Langford being led out of her mansion in yesterday's makeup and this morning's humiliation, her entire empire crumbling in real time on live television. Both villains faced 40 years in federal prison minimum. Both would lose everything. Both would spend the rest of their lives understanding that there are consequences for destroying people who do not deserve it. Vincent found Rowan on the balcony as the sun was setting, the city below them turning gold and then purple. Emma was asleep inside, finally safe, finally certain that the men with guns were there to protect her, not harm her. "You wrote that you loved me," Vincent said again, as if he still could not quite believe it. Rowan turned to face him. The goodbye letter was in his jacket pocket. She could see the edge of the folded paper. "I do," she said. And for the first time in 15 years, Vincent Corsetti knelt in front of someone. Not to harm them. Not to threaten them. But to show them that power meant nothing without someone to share it with. He pulled a ring from his pocket, not gaudy, not excessive, but beautiful in the way that only simple things can be, and he asked her to marry him in a voice so quiet that only she could hear. She said yes. Every day we choose between fear and trust, between closing ourselves off and opening our hearts. The apartment was silent except for the sound of Emma's breathing, steady and deep in sleep, her small body curved under a blanket that had never felt this soft before. Rowan stood at the window of the place that was no longer a temporary shelter but something that felt like home, and she watched the city lights blur through her tears. In her hand was the letter she had written at 3 a.m, the one that said goodbye, the one that said Vincent Corsetti deserved a life without the weight of her survival pulling him down. She had planned to disappear. To vanish before the people who wanted to hurt him could use her as leverage. To protect him the only way she knew how. But Vincent had found her at dawn. He had walked into that apartment with Marco and Nino flanking him like shadows, and instead of anger in his eyes, there was something that looked like understanding. Something that looked like love wearing the shape of a man built on decades of vengeance. He had taken the letter from her trembling hands without a word, read it once, then torn it into pieces that scattered across the floor like snow. "You do not get to choose this ending," he had said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. Not anymore. What happened next unfolded in the hours after that moment, in ways that would reshape every life connected to the violence that had tried to consume them. The evidence that Rowan had secretly gathered, photographs, recordings, bank statements showing money trails, testimony from women Tyler and Sophie had destroyed, went live on every news channel at exactly 6:22 in the morning. Every television screen in New York flickered with the same images. Tyler Brennan's face. Sophie Langford's face. The documentation of systematic cruelty laid bare for millions of people to witness. The society matrons that Sophie considered friends began receiving the same photographs of her cruelty captured in text messages, emails dripping with contempt for the very women she claimed to love. The whispers started in the penthouses and spread like fire through the neighborhoods where people lived with less money but infinitely more dignity. By noon, women were coming forward, their voices no longer silent, their stories no longer buried in shame. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, federal agents were moving into position. By 3, the arrests had begun. Tyler Brennan was found at his office, the one his uncle had built him despite knowing he would waste it. The photographs from his arrest showed him collapsed into sobs, trembling like a cornered animal, begging for mercy that no one was obligated to give. The prosecutors would later describe what they found in his personal files as unconscionable. 40 years minimum. He would spend more time in prison than he had lived outside of it. He would die in a cell, and the world would continue without him, indifferent to his suffering. Sophie Langford's humiliation was different and somehow more complete. She had built her entire existence on the belief that wealth and the right friends could shield you from consequences. When the photographs spread, when the recordings of her cruelty played on every news station, when the women she had destroyed began to speak, her friends did not stand beside her. They abandoned her like rats leaving a sinking ship. The phone calls stopped. The invitations ceased. The designer houses and charity galas that had defined her life simply closed their doors. By evening, her husband had filed for divorce. By the next morning, federal agents arrived with warrants and handcuffs. The photograph that would appear in every newspaper showed Sophie being led out of her mansion in yesterday's makeup, her empire crumbling in real time, and for the first time in her privileged life, she understood what it felt like to be invisible. Both would lose everything. Both would spend decades understanding that there are consequences for destroying people who do not deserve it. And in that justice, something shifted in Vincent's chest. The violence that had defined him for so long could finally rest, because it had transformed into something else. Protection. Not domination. Defense of the innocent, not conquest of the weak. 1 week after the arrests, a sound pulled Rowan's attention from the window. The rumble of engines. Multiple engines. She turned from the glass and felt Emma stir in her sleep, and Rowan's first instinct was fear. But then she heard Vincent's voice in the hallway, steady and calm, and she understood. She opened the door and saw them. 20 men in black. Not arriving as a threat, but as a family coming to meet the woman their boss loved. Marco was first through the door, and in his enormous hands was a teddy bear that stood nearly as tall as Emma herself. Behind him came Nino with an armful of children's books, his scarred face softening when he saw the small girl beginning to wake. One by one they entered, 12 men dressed in suits that cost more than Rowan had earned in a year, each one carrying something for Emma. A toy. A gift wrapped in careful hands. A stuffed animal. A coloring book with new crayons still in their sealed boxes. Vincent stood in the doorway and simply watched. Marco extended the teddy bear toward Emma with the awkwardness of a man who had never held anything fragile in his entire life, and Emma took it without hesitation, burying her face in the soft fabric. "His name is Protector," Marco said, his voice rough but gentle. "He keeps bad dreams away." In that moment, no one in the room could deny what they were witnessing. The most dangerous men in New York being unmade by the trust of a 6-year-old child. Rowan looked at Vincent, and he crossed the room to stand beside her. His hand found hers without asking, without hesitation. The debt that had crushed her for so long, the $200,000 that had felt like a death sentence, had been addressed in a way that shocked her more than any of this could have. Vincent had not paid it. Instead, he had tracked down every loan shark who had preyed on her late husband's desperation, every criminal who had charged illegal interest rates, every person who had profited from her family's suffering. He had recovered the original amount plus every cent of interest they had illegally charged, and he had returned it to Rowan with legal documentation clearing her completely. $47,000, recovered from the people who had stolen it. $153,000 in predatory interest, returned. "You do not owe anyone anything," Vincent had told her that morning, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Not them. Not me. Not anymore." She stood in that apartment surrounded by dangerous men being gentle around her daughter, and she felt something break open inside her chest. Emma was laughing. Emma was safe. Emma was loved by people who would protect her until their dying breath, not because they owed it, but because they chose to. Because Vincent had chosen to see the light in Rowan when she could see nothing but darkness in herself. That night, after the men had left and Emma was asleep clutching her teddy bear, Vincent found Rowan on the balcony. The city below them was turning from gold to purple to black, the stars beginning to emerge above the skyline. The humid August air had finally begun to cool, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded. "You wrote that you loved me," Vincent said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "In that letter. You said you loved me." Rowan turned to face him. The goodbye letter was no longer in his jacket pocket, torn into pieces now, but the memory of those words remained. "I do," she said. And she meant it with a depth that terrified her. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not here because you saved me. I'm here because you let me save myself." Vincent reached into his pocket, and Rowan's breath caught. He pulled out a ring. Not gaudy, not excessive, but beautiful in the way that only simple things can be. Platinum and a single diamond, elegant and understated and perfect. And then Vincent Corsetti, the man who had built an empire on violence and fear, knelt in front of the woman who had taught him what love meant. Not to harm her. Not to threaten her. But to show her that power meant nothing without someone to share it with. "Marry me," he said. Not a question. A promise. A surrender. "Yes," Rowan whispered, and when she said it, Emma woke from her sleep inside and came to the balcony door, her small face pressed against the glass, her voice muffled but clear. "Are you staying now? Are you staying forever?" Vincent rose and turned to look at the child, and Rowan saw the moment he understood. This wasn't just about Rowan. This was about building something new from the broken pieces, about choosing family not by blood but by the courage it took to stay when leaving would be easier. He walked to the door and opened it, and Emma ran to him without hesitation. He lifted her into his arms, and the city lights reflected in his eyes like something sacred. "Yes," he said. "I am staying. We all are. Every day we choose between fear and trust, between closing ourselves off and opening our hearts. Every single day, that choice is ours to make. And sometimes, when we make the right one, it gives us everything we never knew we were searching for." Sometimes saving someone else is exactly how we save ourselves. If this story moved your heart, if these characters stayed with you, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to remember that second chances exist. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story that will change how you see the world. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever helped a stranger and had it transform your own life? We read every single comment. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And remember, your story isn't over yet. We will see you again soon.